I'd like to begin actually by thanking Tal for organizing this extraordinarily exciting conference on personalized medicine. Whenever I come out to California, I am struck by the excitement and the optimism and the sense that the future is going to be better than the past. And so it's really, it really needs to be acknowledged that this conference actually does that about personalized medicine. So it is in that context we're going to move from so much of the excitement that we have heard about personalized medicine to a discussion of what's going on in Washington, which, as we also learned yesterday, makes an enormous amount of difference to the pace of development. How products are regulated, how they are reimbursed, how quickly they are adopted by physicians will determine when personalized medicine actually reaches patients to do all the things that we hope they will do. So that is an introduction to the next session, and I'm very pleased to see that not everyone has left the room. But it truly makes a difference. And I would, in the introduction, be, I would say, along with Brooke Byers and others yesterday, that the glass regarding this is really only half full. We need, in my estimation and the estimation of the Personalized Medicine Coalition, a more proactive government that will, in my view, accelerate the pace of progress. And so with that, I would like to call to the stage my friend and colleague, Andy Fish, to help us understand the Washington environment. Andy is the executive director of AdvaMed DX, a trade association that represents the leading manufacturers of medical diagnostic tests, sometimes called kits. Andy has a long background in Washington, having worked for the United States Senate under the guidance of Senator Patrick Leahy. He also served as Assistant Secretary of Agriculture for Congressional and Government Affairs and represented, before he took his current position, representing manufacturers of non-prescription medicines and also the American Cancer Society. He's a graduate of Yale University and Stanford Law School. And he has come from Washington to help, and if not to help, at least to shed some light on some of the nettlesome issues that both divide and unite the personalized medicine community. So I'm going to introduce the topic by asking Andy what, in your view, is the biggest issue facing the diagnostic community today.
Well, thanks, Ed, and I appreciate the invitation to be here and join you. As Ed said, we're doing a lot of things in Washington that affect the business environment that all of your work eventually gets to. We think the work we're doing is important and has an influence, but it's Washington. Some things take a long time, some things are contentious, and hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on that today in our conversation. So again, I appreciate the opportunity. And I think it would be good if maybe in Ed moment we get to just explain a little more about what trade associations are and kind of who we are and what we're doing. But let me start first with your question, which is what's the most important thing facing at least the folks that I represent, but I think actually facing this whole sector, and it's payment. You heard a number of speakers in the previous sessions reference payment reimbursement for diagnostics. We're going to spend most of our time this morning talking about the regulatory issues confronting the sector, but I spend most of my time personally on payment. It's our biggest issue that we've been focusing on probably for about the last year and a half. I went to my board of directors in June 2012 and I said, I really think payment has now usurped regulation as the number one issue, the biggest barrier to having a robust marketplace going forward for diagnostics. And we've been really sort of doubling down our work on payment ever since. So we could talk a little more about that if you'd like, Ed, but I just wanted to put that out there.
And you mentioned briefly that you represent a trade association. For the benefit of this audience, what is a 501c6 or a trade association? And tell us a little bit about AdvaMed DX. I mentioned you represent kit manufacturers.
Sure,
you know more about it than I do.
Absolutely. So a trade association is typically a member-based association of various commercial entities that come together collectively and fund an operation, usually based in Washington, although not necessarily, to be the advocate, the collective advocate for better or changes in governmental policies. So AdvaMed DX is actually formed as a division of AdvaMed, which is a trade association for the medical device industry at large, has 300 plus members. And about 4 years ago, the diagnostic members of AdvaMed said, you know, our industry is unique in a lot of ways, and we have a story that's not being told the way it should be, and we have a lot of issues that need dealing with. So AdvaMed DX was formed. We have a separate board of directors. I was just meeting with our newly elected board chair, John Bishop, who's CEO of Cepheid, just down the road in Sunnyvale yesterday. And we have about 70 member companies making up our association. So we represent just about all the significant global diagnostic manufacturers that have a presence here in the US. And our function is multifold. As I said, primarily we focus on changing policies, whether that's statutory, working on Capitol Hill with Congress, or it's working with FDA, or it's working with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services to change payment policy. So we are a direct advocate to change policies for the betterment of this sector. We also are a public affairs and media spokesperson. So we do a lot of content development, putting on programs and symposia to educate a range of important stakeholders about the kind of work you do and the kind of work our members do in the field of diagnostics and the role that diagnostic plays in healthcare. There are a gazillion trade associations and similar kinds of entities in Washington. You've heard reference the Coalition for 21st Century Healthcare. Ed heads up the Personalized Medicine Coalition, which is a somewhat broader-based coalition of a number of different kinds of stakeholders. But that is the work we do, and we think we're doing a pretty good job of it, actually.
So in that light, an important distinction between AdvaMed DX and the Personalized Medicine Coalition is the Personalized Medicine Coalition represents all of the stakeholders with an interest in personalized medicine and doesn't share any particular business interest. Rather, we try to bring people together to figure out what the future ought to look like. And that's sometimes a daunting assignment. And again, it's why conferences like this are so important and conversations like this are so important. So Andy, with that in mind, what is AdvaMed DX's position on the regulation of diagnostic tests?
Well, broadly speaking, AdvaMed DX developed a proposal that we call a risk-based approach to the regulation of diagnostics. And it essentially was written something like a draft guidance that FDA would typically put out. It's up on our website if you care to look, as well as a lot of other material, advameddx.org. And essentially proposed that a specific framework for evaluating the risk of diagnostics and associating a level of regulatory review for the level of risk that's determined by that assessment. FDA would, of course, say that it regulates based on risk. We don't dispute that. Our point of developing this proposal was to say that FDA should do so in a more focused way and needs to do a more rigorous and consistent approach to assessing the risk of diagnostics. Our view is that there are many moderate and low-risk diagnostics that need minimal regulatory scrutiny. There are certainly categories of regulatory review for those lower class tests, and there are many that do fall into that category already. So that's our essential premise, that FDA should continue to develop this kind of framework for the regulation of diagnostics. And Ed, I think that probably leads into the topic that you were going to address as well, is what is FDA doing on the regulation of lab-developed tests?
Yeah, so. Well, we'll get to that. One of the big hurdles, and you hear this especially from investors in Silicon Valley, but elsewhere as well, is there's no clear regulatory path for diagnostic companies to follow in order to get their products to market. Many have said it's confused, it's unclear, and it's rate limiting for the field. So my question to you, Andy, is why has it proven so difficult to develop a consensus position that would unite the personalized medicine community around a single regulatory path?
Well, so I think let's go back and review a little bit of what their current regulatory framework actually looks like. So if you're developing and distributing a diagnostic to multiple laboratories, in other words, you're one of my member companies and you're developing a diagnostic and selling it, your FDA requires you to come to FDA for pre-market approval, right? Submit an application. The type of application and the review you have to undergo depends on the risk that FDA assesses for your product. But if you're a laboratory developing your own test for use essentially within your own four walls or within your sites that you control, FDA historically has exercised what it calls regulatory discretion. Those laboratory-developed tests fall within FDA's regulatory jurisdiction by statute, but FDA decades ago said, we're not really concerned about what labs are doing in-house. We think those tests are primarily quite well standardized, they're well-characterized tests in fields that are well understood. This is not an area of great concern. So historically, we've had two different paths to market, essentially, or paths to clinical use for tests. One through FDA if you're distributing widely to laboratories, and one is under regulation called the Clinical Laboratory Improvements Amendments of 1988, or CLIA. I'm sure that many of you are either familiar with CLIA or hear it referenced. CLIA is the statutory framework that CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, use to oversee labs. So we have a CLIA pathway to clinical use through labs. We have an FDA pathway to clinical use through manufacturers. And that's the basic framework. The difficulty in reconciling those two things more recently is, of course, they have very different cost structures and time to market, and of course regulatory requirements. And so there is great concern among the laboratories around what FDA asserting its jurisdiction over laboratory developed tests might mean. And there's a concern among my member companies that there's a lack of consistent approach to assessing risk and what kind of pre-market review is done.
So going back to your proposal, if we did have one regulatory path to market, what, in your view, would it look like?
Well, we have advocated that. Let me back up even further and say it's not about necessarily what we advocate. Let me start from a more basic premise. FDA in 2010 made a very public announcement that it intended to reassert its jurisdiction over laboratory developed tests, that it would go forward and require, at least under some risk-based approach, laboratory developed tests to be submitted to FDA for pre-market review. And it held a public meeting on that topic in 2010. Since that time, it has drafted guidance on the topic and it's moved upward into the White House for final regulatory clearance. It's been sitting there for a long time. So we're in a holding pattern, basically, where we're waiting for FDA and the administration to follow through on something they said they would do several years ago. Our position flows directly out of this risk-based approach. Our view is that there should be one consistent regulatory pathway to market, but again, it should be risk-based, meaning that the tests that are considered the highest risk should be reviewed by FDA on a pre-market basis. Many other tests and many LDTs would fall under lower class categories and receive a lower level of regulatory review or even be exempt. There's many diagnostics that are actually exempt entirely from pre-market review. They simply have to abide by FDA regulation.
So would those laboratory developed tests be regulated both by FDA and CLIA?
Well, so this is an important distinction, and it comes up a lot, this question of, well, is an FDA just going to duplicate what CMS is doing? We already have this CMS oversight under CLIA, so what you're asking for is us to be doubly regulated. And I actually think it would be enlightening, and if you'll pardon me reading a couple paragraphs, it's said better than I can, and the important point is it's not us saying it. CMS actually published a document last fall in which it undertook to explain some of the distinctions between what CLIA oversight means and what FDA oversight means. So in the words of CMS, let me read this to you carefully and then I'll comment on its implications. When a laboratory develops a test system such as an LDT in-house without receiving FDA clearance or approval, CLIA prohibits the release of any test results prior to the laboratory establishing certain performance characteristics relating to analytical validity. In contrast, the FDA's review of analytical validity is done prior to the marketing of the test system. Furthermore, the FDA's process also includes clinical validity, which is the accuracy with which the test identifies, measures, or predicts the absence or presence of a clinical condition or predisposition. Furthermore, unlike the FDA regulatory scheme, CMS's CLIA program does not address the clinical validity of any test. So here's CMS calling out, essentially saying, look, CLIA oversight ensures that labs are doing the right thing to make sure their tests are analytically valid, but unlike FDA, CLIA is not ascertaining the clinical validity of the test. So that's an important distinction that needs to be resolved in some way and reconciled between these two pathways.
So that brings me to a difficult question that I want to ask you. Some of your members say all they want is a level playing field, and isn't that a little bit like saying that the local T-ball team and the San Francisco Giants should play by the same rules?
Well, I'm not sure who you're saying is the Giants and the T-ball team, but I'm not sure I understand that comparison. We don't talk about a level playing field. That's not language or an approach that we as a trade association put out there. Let's back up and say, what's the appropriate public policy here, right? So in just about every area of medicine and healthcare, there is a pre-market approval role for FDA. people aren't making drugs at home and dispensing them to patients without going to FDA for prior approval. And FDA's position is this is an area that's been overlooked for a long time, but more recently with the proliferation, particularly of genetic tests being done as LDTs, FDA is saying, look, there are clearly other risks here. If a woman's going to cut off her breasts because she got a certain test result, then FDA thinks it should have a role in approving that test before it's put into clinical use. So it's really about what's the right public policy approach to tests that have clinically significant risk for patients. And ultimately, whether it's a manufacturer test or it's an LDT, it's put into clinical use, the risk profile for the patient is the same. So it really doesn't matter what pathway you took to get there, you've still got the same risk profile. And the question is, what kind of public policy apparatus do we want in place to assure a certain level of safety for patients? FDA, of course, argues that it should be the arbiter of clinical validity and as well as analytical validity for these tests. There are a lot of stakeholders, obviously, that would be content to remain with CMS oversight. And I think whichever side you come down on, the fact is right now we basically, again, two pathways to market with very different financial implications and certain levels of patient safety questions I think that's still out there, as many others have commented. And so those things have to be reconciled.
So if our friend Alan Mertz was here, and Alan is the president of the American Clinical Laboratory Association, which is another trade association that represents clinical labs that make laboratory-developed tests, including Quest and LabCorp, two of the biggest members. But one of the things that Alan contends, and Andy's heard this before, is that the AdvaMed DX proposals would stifle innovation. What's your answer to that? And that's especially important out here in California, where they say a prayer to innovation every morning.
Well, our companies innovate all the time, right? So our companies depend on innovation just as much as anyone for the lifeblood of what they do. And I think any one of them would be proud to stand up and defend their record of innovation. I think it still comes back to a more basic question of what's the right balance from a public policy standpoint between innovation and protecting patients. And I think that I'm sure that everyone in the room and everyone outside this room who's involved in this field feels that they are taking appropriate care to protect patients. That's really not the issue, whether or not there are many labs that do a great job. The question is, do you want a public policy system in place that gives that assurance to the general public and to patients who are using those tests? That is a public policy system that we accept and embrace for virtually every other product that carries a significant risk for patients. FDA has stated its intent to try to address that issue here. We think that's appropriate. I do want to hasten to say, though, and it comes back to this question around innovation and what's the level of regulatory burden is, there's many factors that we think go into this regulation in terms of assessing risk. I mean, there's all sorts of things that FDA could take into consideration, and we believe should take into consideration the fact that companies are never going to commercialize tests for extremely rare diseases. There's no market in it, right? So you've got to take into consideration, how do you continue to sustain what labs do in the field of LDTs? We are not saying, and our companies are not saying, that LDTs should go away. There's clearly a role for LDTs. LDTs are also, kind of a farm, team, and sometimes for, tests that become more widely commercialized and distributed. So you need to take into account rare diseases. You need to take into account research and an ongoing investigation. And we think FDA can appropriately consider those things. And I think FDA also needs to take into consideration where these tests are actually performed. I mean, what kind of laboratory they're being done in, what's the level of expertise, and so forth. All of those things are risk factors that FDA should take into account. So ultimately, we'd like to see FDA continuing to provide an environment in which many LDTs continue to flourish.
So you mentioned earlier that FDA has a proposal to end its enforcement discretion, not to regulate LDTs, and that has a well-developed proposal. Can you elaborate a little bit more on where that proposal is and what you see is likely to happen?
Yeah, well, it's, as I said before, FDA's drafted guidance that would make its intentions clear in this area and would lay out a path forward. We're eager to see that, of course. I think everyone is. Not everyone wants it to actually be issued, of course, but I think that if it does come forward, it would be read with great interest. Our understanding, again, as I said, is that it's been basically under review at the level of the Office of Management Budget in the White House, which is the entity that reviews all proposed regulations before it allows them to be released. Again, our understanding, the White House will not comment on this specifically, although we and others have met with them. Our understanding is pretty clear that what OMB is doing is assessing exactly the same sort of questions I said. What's the sort of risk-benefit trade-off of further regulation in this area versus public health. And they've asked FDA to provide more information along those lines, and they're taking that into consideration. Of course, this takes place in a broader political environment where you've got all manner of things going on in healthcare. I think maybe you're aware of that. Affordable Care Act implementation and all those sort of issues are consuming the White House and consuming the larger healthcare policy apparatus. So it may be that this issue just continues to sit, on the second tier shelf for the moment. It'll be revisited at some point. I think that FDA has really, kind of stepped out again over the last 6 to 9 months and talked a lot more about this issue. Dr. Hamburg, who's commissioner of FDA, and Dr. Collins, who's the director of NIH, both wrote a commentary in the New England Journal of Medicine from November, in which they commented on the approval of Illumina's MySeq DX. And they commented in that article that there was a need for greater oversight of higher risk LDTs. So I think that the issue is still ripe within Washington. I think the question is probably still when, not if, but it's anyone's guess as to when that guidance comes out.
So you just mentioned the FDA's recent approval of Illumina's 4 next-generation sequencing devices for specific indications. And so the question is, what's the significance of that approval for the future of the field, where FDA is entering into next-generation sequencing?
Well, I think obviously implications are large. I think it actually raises some interesting questions, I think almost metaphysical questions about what is a test, right? So if FDA typically has approved a test indication by indication, and it's approved genetic tests or molecular tests that are specifically for a particular SNP, for example, the fact that FDA has given analytical validity blessing to Illumina's platform will, as in FDA's own words, basically facilitate and support the further development of LDTs in this area, as well as, of course, potentially clinically validated tests that go through FDA using Illumina's platform. And
that's groundbreaking.
Well, I think it clearly is another evolution in where we are, and the fact that FDA was willing to give not only specific approvals for some certain tests to be run on the platform, but also an analytical approval of the platform, I think was, I personally think it was very positive. I think it was heartening that FDA saw its way clear to approving that platform. It'll continue to open up the field with all the implications that are being discussed at this conference, so I think that's all a good thing. I think there's an interesting question as to, if we get further and further down the road, and we've been talking about the relatively lower cost of producing that genome sequence, then further tests of that sequence aren't running the sequence, it's just querying the data, right? So I think that's an interesting question, then that is the test, but what control does FDA have over that? Or is that really the practice of medicine once you've generated that underlying data? I'm not sure FDA itself knows exactly how it's going to confront that, and maybe one of the subsequent speakers will address it. But I think that's going to be the interesting test of regulation going forward in this area, is exactly that. You generate data on an FDA-validated platform, but then the interpretation and the decision-making around what targets are of clinical significance, does FDA really able to retain a hand in that? It's not really clear.
Last question before we go to the audience. What can we do to work more closely together to solve some of these nettlesome issues?
Well, I think that the best thing we can do is to do exactly what we said, is in fact to work more closely together. And I should point out for sure that we have obviously a close relationship. We have a close relationship with the American Clinical Laboratory Association, with Alan Mertz, who is not able to join us this morning. And we're working actually together very closely with ACLA on payment reform. We've been working month in, month out now on reforms that we're proposing to be done legislatively for CMS reimbursement of diagnostics, and we've been up on Congress together week in and week out. If we can come together on things that are as challenging as payment, I'm sure that we can continue to come together on things like regulation. And honestly, right now, I don't see it as a us versus ACLA. What I see it is FDA has stepped forward, it said it's going to act, we're all waiting to see if it does. And when it does, I think there will be many things that we can discuss productively with everyone else in this space, and I wouldn't be surprised if we can agree on 90% plus.
Do we have questions in the audience, and especially, yeah, John.
Great presentation. Can you comment at a high level about FDA in terms of the earlier purpose, which is both safety and efficacy? Is the efficacy discussion in Washington pretty active, and if so, how? In other words, the focus on actionable tests is critical. The safety, what you mentioned before about LDTs, is critical. But I wonder, it's kind of these esoteric questions, how do we get them to think about efficacy that we want them to?
When you say them, do you mean FDA or? Well, I think FDA is clearly focused on efficacy, and I think that, I guess what they would say from the efficacy standpoint is, that's wrapped up obviously in clinical validity. Is this test actually going to be useful for what you say it's useful for? That goes to the clinical claim part, right? So, FDA obviously, looks at both of those questions. Safety and efficacy, I think, are somewhat concepts are somewhat wrapped together. I'm not sure you can completely extricate one from the other, because safety depends on getting the analytical result that you said you were getting, and it also depends on whether or not you're applying it to the right disease state and getting the right answer. So I think, FDA thinks about efficacy all the time. I think there are some interesting questions around, do we need to always have claims of clinical validity? And on a topic that we don't have time to really go into much, we've actually been working with the FDA to develop what we call a transitional pathway, under which some new diagnostics could come to market for a temporary period that would have an analytical claim only, without a clinical claim. And those tests could be put into use for a period of time while a manufacturer developed further clinical data. I think, and I'm pleased to say that I think FDA is, still working with us on that, and is open to perhaps exploring that area further.
We are unfortunately out of time, so I invite you to join me in thanking Andy for coming across the country to
Thank you, Ed.
share this with us.
Thank you.